Snow hammers a lonely cabin high above the valley, and a former Navy SEAL stands listening, his body reacting before his mind admits why. Beside him, a German shepherd freezes ears sharp, sensing a danger the storm is trying to hide. Somewhere below the tree line, a truck sits abandoned, a child missing, and the mountain begins to shift in ways it shouldn't. He doesn't open the door to curiosity, he opens it to responsibility. With a soldier's instincts and a dog trained to trust what can't be seen, one man steps into the white darkness, knowing the storm isn't the real threat tonight. The mountain is. Would you follow the warning, or stay inside and hope? Where are you watching from? Please like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and grace. Snow arrived without ceremony over Telluride, Colorado, a white weight pressing down on roofs, pines, and memory turning sound into a muffled thing that made even breathing feel deliberate. Daniel Brooks stood at the narrow window of his timber cabin and watched the storm move like a living animal, patient and certain. He was 42, built tall and lean from years that had taught his muscles to obey, before his mind could argue, shoulders squared, not in pride, but habit. His face was all angles, strong jaw straight, nose, cheekbones sharpened by altitude and restraint, kept clean-shaven because he disliked how beards hid expressions he didn't trust himself to have. His hair, dark blonde threaded with early gray, was cut short and practical, the kind of cut men choose when mirrors are tools, not companions. Daniel had the pale, weathered skin of someone who spent more time outdoors than under forgiving lights, and eyes the color of cold steel blue, steady, observant, always measuring distance. People in town said he was polite but distant, respectful, yet closed, the kind of man who held doors and conversations with the same careful economy. What had shaped that restraint was not age, but an incident 6 years earlier, an extraction off the Black Sea coast that went wrong, costing 2 teammates and leaving Daniel with a limp in his right leg and a guilt that never learned how to sleep. He lived alone by choice, but not in solitude. At his feet lay Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose presence filled the cabin more completely than furniture ever could. Ranger was large and athletic, around 40 kilos of disciplined power, his black and tan coat darkened along the saddle of his back like a shadow that refused to leave. His ears stood erect even at rest, as if the world were an endless briefing, and his amber eyes held an intelligence that unsettled strangers and comforted Daniel in equal measure. A long, pale scar ran through the fur at Ranger's left shoulder, a souvenir from shrapnel during his final deployment, and a faint hitch marked his gait when he turned too fast. It didn't slow him. It reminded him. Ranger's temperament was calm, alert, almost judicial, never wasteful with noise, never dramatic. Where Daniel carried his past in silence, Ranger carried it in vigilance. The cabin itself mirrored its owner, solid, functional, unadorned. A single rifle hung locked and unloaded, more memory than weapon. A pot of coffee simmered on the stove, bitter and strong, chosen for effect rather than comfort. Daniel drank it without sugar, standing as if sitting too long invited thoughts to take root. He told himself he had come to the mountain for quiet, but quiet had a way of amplifying things. Outside, the wind combed the slope in long strokes, rattling the metal roof until it complained like an old ship at sea. Ranger lifted his head, not abruptly, not theatrically, just enough to change the air. His ears angled toward the door, then the wall, then the floor, nose working, reading messages. Daniel could not. Daniel felt it then, the subtle tightening under his ribs, the old instinct clicking into place. This was not the sound of branches or the ordinary anger of wind. It was irregular, wrong, like a rhythm missing a beat. Daniel shifted his weight, the familiar protest in his leg flaring and fading. War left receipts, and the body collected them whether the mind agreed or not. He crouched beside Ranger, fingers brushing the thick fur at the dog's neck, grounding himself in something real. Ranger did not look at him. He stared at the door as if the storm itself had learned how to knock. Daniel exhaled slowly, counting without numbers the way he used to when radios went quiet and plans dissolved. He told himself it was only weather, that mountains liked to test those who thought they understood them. Yet another thought pressed in, unwelcome but clear storms rarely arrived alone. Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the porch light, the snow shifted with a sound too deliberate to be chance. Ranger rose, silent body aligned with the threshold, not blocking Daniel, but claiming the space as if to say, whatever comes next, we meet it awake. Daniel straightened, heart steady, not calm, but ready, and reached for his coat. He did not open the door. Not yet. Some lessons were learned the hard way, and one of them was that you listened first to the weather, to the mountain, and sometimes if you were wise enough to the dog who had already decided the night would matter. The knock never came, but Ranger's body tightened as if it had his weight shifting forward. Nails whispering against the pine floor, nose lifted toward the seam under the door where cold air slipped inside like a spy. Daniel Brooks pulled on his weathered parka and opened the door into a wall of snow that felt less like weather and more like intention, the wind pressing against him with a stubborn, almost curious force. Outside, the porch light carved a weak yellow circle into the white dark, and within that circle Ranger paused, head low, ears forward, reading the ground the way Daniel once read maps before insertion. The tracks appeared suddenly half-buried but wrong, too frantic, too light in places, as if someone had run, slipped, stood still to think, then run again. Daniel felt the familiar shift inside him, the mental click from civilian quiet to operational clarity, a switch he pretended was gone, but which had only been waiting. He followed Ranger downhill, boots crunching through fresh drifts, the slope steeper than it looked, the forest closing in with heavy-limbed pines sagging under ice. Ranger moved with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, occasionally circling back to confirm Daniel's presence with a quick glance that said, "Keep up." They found the truck just beyond the tree line, a silver pickup angled poorly near an old service road, engine cold, driver's door open like a mouth that had tried to call for help and failed. Snow had already begun to reclaim it. Inside lay a single glove, child-sized blue with cartoon wolves printed along the cuff, absurdly cheerful against the severity of the night. Daniel's jaw tightened. Ranger whined once low and controlled, then bolted 20 meters downslope and began to dig. The sound of his paws changed as he broke through a crusted layer into softer snow, and Daniel dropped to his knees beside him, hands burning as he shoveled snow away with bare urgency. They uncovered a hollow formed by fallen rocks and wind-packed drifts, and inside it lay a boy, curled tight, breathing shallow, but steady. He couldn't have been more than 10. His name, Daniel learned later, was Evan Miller, a thin, sharp-boned child with pale skin turned waxy from cold freckles dusted across his nose like spilled rust, dark brown hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and melting snow. Evan's eyes fluttered open when Daniel spoke, blue and glassy, but aware, the eyes of a kid who had learned too early that panic wasted air. "My mom," Evan whispered, teeth chattering hard enough to hurt. "She told me to hide." Daniel wrapped him in his parka without argument, Ranger pressing close to lend heat, and felt something old and heavy settle in his chest, not fear, but responsibility. He started back uphill, each step a negotiation with the slope, Ranger flanking him like a living brace. When the dog stopped again, muscles rigid, head snapping toward a stand of trees Daniel hadn't noticed before. Ranger's nose cut the air, and then he moved, pulling Daniel not toward the cabin but deeper into the storm. Daniel hesitated, the sensible voice in his head listing priorities, shelter, heat, radio. But another voice trained by years when choosing wrong meant not coming home spoke louder. He followed. The trees thinned into a narrow ravine where wind had scoured the ground down to ice. There, wedged against a split boulder, lay a woman half buried in snow. She was conscious, barely, her breath coming in short, controlled pulls, like someone who refused to give the cold the satisfaction of panic. Laura Miller was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry in the way mountain towns shape people, with ash-blonde hair braided tight against her scalp, now fraying loose and rimed with frost. Her skin was pale but not fragile, marked by sun and wind, the face of a woman used to being outdoors because life required it, not because it was romantic. Blood darkened the leg of her jeans where she'd taken a fall, but her eyes, clear, green, steady, even through pain, tracked Daniel, immediately assessing him, the way mothers assess risk before gratitude. "Evan," she asked, voice hoarse but controlled. "He's alive," Daniel said, and the relief that crossed her face was swift and fierce, a crack in the dam she'd been holding. Ranger stood between them, angled protectively but calm, a silent assurance that whatever happened next would be managed. Daniel worked quickly, splinting her leg with a fallen branch and a length of cord from his pack movements, efficient without being rough, speaking little because tone mattered more than words. Laura didn't cry out. She clenched her jaw and nodded once, accepting help the way strong people do with conditions. As Daniel hauled her upright, the ground trembled faintly beneath them, a deep, distant thump that Ranger felt, first ears flattening for a heartbeat before lifting again. Daniel felt it then too, not with his ears but his feet, a wrongness traveling through the mountain's bones. Snow slid off branches in heavy sighs. Laura noticed his stillness. "What was that?" she asked. Daniel looked upslope, then at Ranger, who stared into the white with unblinking focus. "Something waking up," Daniel said. He didn't like how true it sounded. They began the slow climb back toward the cabin, Daniel supporting Laura, Ranger scouting ahead, and behind them the storm-closed ranks erasing their tracks as if the mountain preferred no witnesses. They reached the cabin just before the wind shifted, not easing but changing its mind. The kind of subtle turn that carried consequence. Daniel Brooks helped Laura Miller onto the bench near the stove, the heat coaxing color back into her face in reluctant increments, while Ranger stationed himself at the doorway like a verdict that had already been reached. Evan lay wrapped in blankets on the floor, small chest rising in careful rhythm, eyes following Ranger, as if the dog were the most reliable thing left in the world. Daniel worked without ceremony, checking circulation setting, Laura's splint more securely, speaking only when clarity mattered. Outside, the storm kept its distance for a moment as if listening. Daniel's radio crackled when he powered it on static, thick as crushed ice. He gave his call sign once, then again, voice even. The reply came thin but present, and with it a new human shape entered the night. Ranger reacted first, ears angling toward the switchback below the cabin, then the sound arrived, an engine fighting uphill, stubborn and slow. The vehicle emerged through the trees with its lights dimmed against the snow, and when it stopped, a woman stepped out who moved like someone used to being obeyed by weather rather than intimidated by it. Emily Carter introduced herself with a nod instead of a smile. A U.S. Forest Service Ranger in her late 30s, medium height, athletic build, her posture straight without stiffness. She wore her dark hair in a low knot beneath a wool cap, a practical choice that left no loose ends for the wind to take. Her skin was olive-toned and weathered at the cheekbones, eyes a sharp hazel that measured distance instinctively. Emily spoke plainly, the way people do when they've learned that kindness works better when paired with precision. She listened as Daniel summarized, the night eyes narrowing at the mention of the tremor, the direction of the slope, the place Ranger had stopped. They stepped outside together. Snow whispered across the porch boards, and the mountain answered with another low, distant thump that traveled up through the soles of Daniel's boots. Emily went still, head tilting, one gloved hand pressed to the trunk of a nearby pine as if the tree might translate. "That's not wind," she said, not as an opinion, but a fact. Ranger moved downslope a few steps and pawed at the snow, then looked back at Daniel with an insistence that bypassed language. Emily watched the exchange, recognition softening her expression. "He's trained," she said, "and he trusts you." Daniel didn't correct her. Some truths didn't need refining. They followed Ranger to the edge of a narrow cut where the snow lay smooth in a way that felt curated. Ranger scraped once, then twice, exposing a darker layer beneath damp and wrong. Emily crouched, fingers hovering inches above the surface, reading the story in texture and sound. "Rain on snow," she said quietly. "Meltwater's running under the slab. If there's vibration, natural or otherwise, it could go." Daniel remembered the abandoned pickup, the frantic tracks, the hollow he'd pulled Evan from. He looked upslope and felt the same tightness he used to feel before breaching a door that might explode. Emily radioed for an update, voice clipped professional. The reply carried bad news, wrapped in calm. A maintenance crew had been clearing an old access spur earlier in the week, equipment heavy enough to wake a sleeping ridge. Emily closed her eyes for half a beat, recalibrating. "We need eyes on the north face," she said. "Now." Daniel glanced back at the cabin. Laura watched from the window. Green eyes steady despite pain, a mother's attention split between her child and the world beyond the glass. Evan slept. Ranger waited. Daniel made the decision without announcing it, the way he always had. They moved fast, but not loud, Daniel favoring his leg. Ranger pacing him, Emily scanning the tree line with practiced economy. The slope opened into a clearing where the snowpack showed a faint, terrible signature, a hairline fracture running laterally, subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone who wanted to sleep through it. Ranger stopped short of the line and lowered his head, breathing slow and deep. Emily's jaw set. "That wasn't here yesterday," she said. Another thump rolled through the ground, closer this time, followed by the soft hiss of settling snow. Daniel marked the spot with bright tape from his kit hands, steady, despite the memory rising uninvited, the sound of concrete collapsing the way dust erased men. He pushed it down and stayed present. "We need to warn the valley," he said. Emily nodded, already keying her radio, relaying coordinates. Urgency, layered under control. Ranger turned back toward the cabin, once then again toward the slope, caught between duties. Daniel placed a hand on the dog's neck, a brief pressure that meant stay. "We'll come back." Ranger exhaled, the decision accepted. They returned to the cabin as the wind resumed its argument with the roof. Emily paused at the threshold, eyes on Laura and Evan on the small island of warmth Daniel had made without claiming it. "You did right," she said, and there was weight behind the words. Daniel watched the storm through the window and felt the night narrow into a corridor of choices. The mountain had remembered something it wanted to say, and he understood with unsettling clarity that listening was no longer optional. By the time dawn tried to thin the storm, it failed politely, leaving the mountain wrapped in a dim gray that made distance unreliable. Daniel Brooks stood at the cabin table, radio pressed to his ear, Ranger seated at his left like a sentry who knew the perimeter had widened overnight. Emily Carter's voice came through in clipped intervals. Roads partially blocked, valley crews mobilizing, weather refusing to cooperate. Daniel listened without interrupting, absorbing the cadence of urgency, the places where silence meant uncertainty rather than calm. Laura Miller dozed upright on the bench, pain softened by heat and exhaustion, her ash-blonde braid loosened, now strands sticking to her temple. Evan slept close by, fingers curled into Ranger's fur as if anchoring himself to something that wouldn't move. Emily returned just after sunrise with another vehicle and another human presence the night had not planned for. Sheriff Michael Alvarez stepped out into the snow with the posture of a man accustomed to being watched. He was in his late 40s, broad across the shoulders, with a compact strength that came from work rather than gyms, his beard trimmed short and already flecked with frost. His face bore the calm lines of someone who had learned to speak slowly when others spoke, loud brown eyes steady beneath the brim of a weathered hat. Alvarez had grown up in these mountains, which showed in the way he tested the ground with his heel before committing his weight. He shook Daniel's hand firmly, a grip that conveyed respect without ceremony. "We've got folks waking up in cabins below you," he said. "They don't know what you know yet." They stepped outside together. Ranger moved ahead, stopping where the slope fell away into the trees. The wind dropped for a heartbeat, as if the mountain were holding breath. Alvarez watched Ranger's posture change, the dog's muscles drawing tight without noise. "That dog's telling you something," he said. Daniel nodded. "He's telling me not to waste time." Emily crouched and traced the fracture with her eyes from a safe distance, then looked back at Alvarez. "If that releases," she said, "it won't be dramatic at first. It'll just start. And then it won't stop." The decision arrived without fanfare. Alvarez radioed for an immediate advisory, his voice calm but edged, while Emily relayed coordinates and risk zones. Daniel returned to the cabin to prepare Laura and Evan for evacuation. Laura woke fully, then pain sharpening her awareness. She met Daniel's eyes without flinching. "We can move," she said. "Tell me how." Daniel appreciated the lack of drama. He explained the route, the timing, the need to leave belongings behind. Laura nodded, once the nod of a woman who had already chosen her priorities years ago. Evan looked from face to face, fear present but managed. Ranger rose and nudged the boy's knee gently, a promise delivered without words. They moved downhill in a staggered line, Daniel in front with Ranger ranging, Alvarez bringing up the rear. Emily cutting wide to scan for changes. Snow hissed across the surface like static. Halfway down the mountain spoke again, a low, resonant thump that traveled through bone. The sound changed Ranger immediately. He veered left, pulling Daniel toward a stand of trees that offered marginal cover. Alvarez swore softly, not in panic but recognition. "That's closer," he said. Emily keyed her radio again, voice precise. "Advance your timeline," she said to the valley. Now. At a narrow bend they met resistance, not from the mountain, but from people. A couple stood beside a snowmobile, angled poorly, arguing with each other and with the weather. The man, Tyler Grant, was in his early 30s, tall and wiry with a patchy beard and the restless energy of someone who believed effort could replace planning. His jacket was unzipped, despite the cold breath steaming as he talked. Beside him stood his partner, Megan Ruiz, shorter and sturdier, late 20s, dark hair pulled back tight, cheeks flushed from cold and frustration. Megan's eyes tracked Ranger first, then Daniel, calculating. "We were heading up to check our place," Tyler said. "We heard sirens." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He stepped closer until Tyler stopped moving. "You're going down," Daniel said, voice even. "If you keep climbing, you'll be in the path." Tyler bristled. Megan touched his arm, a quiet correction. Ranger sat between them, and the slope posture relaxed but immovable. Tyler saw it then, the line he wasn't going to cross. He nodded once, pride folding into sense. They reached the lower road as the first official vehicles arrived, lights muted by snow. Alvarez handed off Laura and Evan to medics, pausing long enough to make sure names were written down and hands were held. Daniel stood back, Ranger at heel, watching the operation with the practiced eye of someone who knew when to lead and when to let systems work. Another tremor rolled through the ground, stronger this time, followed by the soft roar of snow settling. Not yet, but soon. Emily caught Daniel's gaze. "You're staying?" she asked. Daniel looked upslope then at Ranger, who had not taken his eyes off the mountain since the first warning. "I am," Daniel said. "So is he." They moved to a vantage point that allowed visibility without exposure. The fracture line had lengthened, a quiet scar stretching wider than before. Alvarez coordinated roadblocks below, voice steady over the radio. Somewhere in the valley, sirens began their long rising call, not panicked, but insistent. Daniel felt the familiar narrowing of focus, the world reduced to variables he could influence. Ranger leaned into his leg, a solid grounding pressure. The mountain did not move yet. It was deciding. And Daniel understood that when it did, the margin for error would vanish. The release did not arrive like thunder. It began with a breath, a deep settling sound that rolled through the valley as if the mountain were exhaling after holding too much for too long. Daniel Brooks felt it through his boots first, then through Ranger's body as the dog leaned hard into his leg, not in fear but in confirmation. Snow along the fracture line slumped, slid, then broke free in a controlled surge that roared downslope in white layers, powerful but mercifully angled away from the town below. Trees snapped like brittle matches. Powder leapt into the air, and then slowly, decisively, it stopped. The mountain had spoken, and it was finished. For several seconds, no one moved. Radios crackled without words. Then Sheriff Michael Alvarez's voice cut through, steady and clear, calling for head counts and confirmations. Emergency lights blinked along the lower road, and the valley answered with noise engines, boots, voices, but not panic. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ranger's ears remained forward, eyes tracking the slope, but his posture softened tension, draining from his shoulders in a way that felt almost human. As daylight strengthened, the damage revealed itself in careful increments. The slide had carved a raw scar into the north face, but the evacuation corridor held. No homes were taken, no lives lost. Down by the staging area, people gathered wrapped in blankets and borrowed coats, clinging to coffee cups like anchors. Laura Miller stood among them, her injured leg braced, Evan pressed against her side. She watched the mountain with a quiet intensity, then turned when she saw Daniel approaching. Her face, still pale, still tired, broke into something fragile and bright. She crossed the space with a determined limp and hugged him without asking permission. Daniel stiffened for half a heartbeat, then returned the embrace with careful strength. Evan followed, arms around Ranger's neck, burying his face in thick fur. Ranger endured it with stoic patience, tail thumping exactly once against the packed snow. Near the command vehicle stood a woman Daniel had not met before, observing the scene with the posture of someone who cataloged outcomes for a living. Nora Whitfield, the county emergency coordinator, introduced herself with a brisk nod. She was in her mid-40s, tall and composed, dark hair, cut just above the shoulders, silver threaded through it like proof of earned authority. Her face held fine lines at the eyes from squinting at maps and forecasts, and her voice carried the efficient warmth of someone who believed preparation was an act of care. "Your early warning mattered," she told Daniel plainly. "Minutes matter in terrain like this." Daniel accepted the words without ceremony. Praise had never been his fuel. Outcome was. By afternoon, the storm retreated to flurries, almost polite now, as if embarrassed by its earlier insistence. The road reopened in sections. Families began returning to homes that still stood. At the cabin, Emily Carter joined Daniel on the porch, both of them watching the altered slope through thinning snow. Emily removed her gloves and rubbed her hands together, breath fogging. "The mountain will heal," she said. "It always does. It just doesn't care how long it takes." Daniel nodded. "Neither do some people," he said. Emily smiled faintly, recognizing the truth beneath the humor. When quiet finally returned, it felt different than before, not empty, but settled. Daniel brewed coffee that afternoon, and found without planning to that he added sugar. He carried 2 mugs outside, handed one to Emily, then sat on the step beside Ranger. The dog lay down with a long sigh, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Daniel looked at the slope again, then at the tracks leading away from the cabin already filling with fresh snow. For the first time in years, the mountain did not feel like a place to hide. It felt like a place to stand. Word spread quickly in Telluride. Over the following days, neighbors stopped by, not with questions, but with food offers of help and the awkward gratitude of people unused to saying thank you out loud. Sheriff Alvarez returned once more, this time without urgency, and left behind a simple sign for the trailhead below North Face closed winter hazard. Daniel watched him hammer it in, feeling a strange satisfaction in the permanence of small things. That evening, as the sky cleared to a hard blue and stars pricked through the cold, Daniel fixed another sign near his cabin path. The letters were uneven, the wood rough, but the message was clear. Mountain Shelter Winter Storm Aid. He didn't call it a refuge or a sanctuary. He called it what it was, a promise to open the door when it mattered. Ranger sat beside him, 6 years old and solid as ever, scar bright against dark fur eyes reflecting starlight. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's neck and felt the steady beat of life beneath his palm. Later, when Laura and Evan returned to thank him properly, Evan handed Daniel a crumpled drawing of a man, a dog, and a mountain with a line through it, the danger crossed out. Daniel pinned it inside the cabin above the stove. He stood there a long moment, then smiled, small, real, unguarded. The mountain was quiet now, not with loneliness, but with permission. And Daniel Brooks, once defined by what he had survived, understood at last that staying, opening, and belonging could be acts of courage too. Sometimes a miracle doesn't arrive as a voice from the sky or a sudden burst of light. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through instinct, through courage, through a choice made in the cold when turning away would have been easier. In this story, the mountain did not spare lives by accident. It spared them because someone listened, because a man chose responsibility over isolation, because a loyal dog trusted what could not yet be seen. If you are watching this today and carrying your own storm, fear, loss, exhaustion, or doubt, remember this: God often works through ordinary moments. Through doors we decide to open. Through warnings we choose not to ignore. Through kindness that feels small but changes everything. The same God who watches over mountains watches over your home, your work, your family, and your tomorrow. May He place His protection around you. May He guide your steps when the path feels uncertain, and may He send you the quiet signs you need right on time. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what storm you're walking through. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and grace. May God bless you, keep you safe, and lead you gently through every winter until you find your spring.